Nobody expected what Frank Costello did when Rocco the Blade. Torrino burst through the door with a knife in each hand. March 15, 1934. Costello's private office on the 12th floor of the Chrysler building. Torrino had come to collect a $50,000 blood debt, sent by the Sicilian mob to carve up the man they called the upstart Calabrian. But what happened in the next 7 minutes did just shock the 2 bodyguards bleeding on the carpet. It created a legend. 36 knife wounds later, Torrino stumbled out blind, broken, and begging for mercy. And Frank Costello. He straightened his tie, lit a cigarette, and made a phone call that would change organized crime forever. To understand that bloody Thursday afternoon, you need to understand the war brewing between the old and new guard of the Italian underworld. March 1934. Prohibition was ending, the golden age of bootlegging was over, and every crime family in New York was scrambling for new territory. Frank Costello, only 43 years old, had just made the boldest move in mob history. He'd formed an alliance with Jewish gangsters, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, Irish bosses like Oni Madden, and even black policy kings in Harlem. In the old country, Sicilians didn't do business with outsiders, but Frank wasn't playing by old country rules. Salvatore Maranzano's loyal soldiers called it an abomination. Francesco Castiglia they spat, using his birth name like a curse. The dirty Calabrian thinks he's better than tradition. The message came through 3 different channels. Frank had 1 week to dissolve his multi-ethnic partnerships and submit to pure Sicilian authority, or he'd be made an example of. Frank's response was delivered through his lawyer. Tradition is fine for museums. I'm building the future. That's when they sent Rocco the Blade to 6'4", 260 pounds of Sicilian muscle who decarved his reputation into the flesh of 17 men across Brooklyn and the Bronx. Torrino didn't just kill people, he made them suffer. His specialty was the Sicilian necktie, cutting a man's throat and pulling his tongue through the wound. But for Frank Costello, Torrino had something special planned. 36 precise cuts, 1 for each year of Torrino's life. The message would be clear: respect, tradition, or die screaming. March 15th started like any other day for Frank. Coffee at 6 a.m. in his penthouse apartment on Central Park West. Wall Street Journal over Eggs Benedict. A call to Judge William O'Dwyer about favorable rulings on some pending bootlegging charges. Frank dressed in his usual uniform. Charcoal gray 3-piece suit, burgundy tie, Italian leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. He never carried a gun, didn't believe in them. Violence is the last refuge of the incompetent, he'd tell his associates. Frank Costello solved problems with his mind, not his fists, but on this particular Thursday, his mind wouldn't be enough. At 2:47 p.m., Frank was alone in his office on the 12th floor of the Chrysler building, reviewing loan shark accounts from his various operations. His 2 bodyguards, Tommy Torrino and Sal the Fish Maroni, were in the outer office playing cards and sharing a bottle of bourbon. The office was Frank's sanctuary, floor 2 ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, imported Italian marble, a mahogany desk that cost more than most people made in a year. The elevator dinged. Frank didn't look up from his ledgers. He was expecting Meyer Lansky at 3 o'clock to discuss their new gambling operation in Florida. But the footsteps coming down the hall weren't Meyer's. They were heavy, deliberate, predatory. Frank's pen stopped moving. In 30 years of street life, he'd learned to trust his instincts. Something was wrong. The door exploded open. Rocco the Blade, Torrino filled the doorframe like a nightmare made flesh. In his right hand, a 10-inch stiletto with a bone handle. In his left, a 7-inch skinning knife with dried blood still on the blade. Behind him, Tommy and Sal lay motionless on the outer office floor, throats cut ear to ear. Torrino had taken out 2 armed men without making a sound. Frank Costello, Torrino said, his voice like gravel grinding against steel. Salvatore Maranzano sends his regards. Frank slowly set down his pen, didn't stand up, didn't reach for a weapon he didn't carry. Just looked at the man sent to kill him with the same expression he might give a waiter bringing the wrong order. Rocco Torrino, Frank said quietly. I heard you were the best. Looking at you now, I'm starting to have my doubts. Torrino stepped into the office, closing the door behind him with his foot. You got 30 seconds to say your prayers, Calabrian. Then I start cutting. You know what your problem is, Rocco. Frank stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. You think this is about respect? About tradition? About proving who's tougher? He walked around his desk, moving closer to the man with 2 knives. But this isn't about any of that. This is about fear. Torrino laughed, a sound like breaking glass. I ain't afraid of nothing. I'm not talking about your fear, Frank said, now only 6 feet away from certain death. I'm talking about Maranzano's fear. He sent you here because he knows I'm right. The old ways are dying. The future belongs to men who can adapt. Enough talking. Torrino raised both knives. Time to die. That's when Frank Costello did something that would become legend in the violent world of organized crime. Instead of backing away, instead of begging, instead of trying to run, Frank stepped forward. Not attacking, not fighting, just stepping into the range of both knives. You want to cut me, Rocco? Go ahead. But I want you to remember something first. Torrino hesitated, confused by Frank's complete lack of fear. What I want you to remember that I never carried a gun because I never needed one. And I never needed one because I never made enemies I couldn't handle. Frank's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But today, For the first time in my life, I'm going to make an exception. Before Torrino could process what that meant, Frank's right hand shot out like a striking snake, but he wasn't going for a weapon, he was going for Torrino's wrist. Frank grabbed the hand holding the stiletto and twisted with a strength that surprised even him. The knife clattered to the marble floor. Torrino swung the skinning knife at Frank's throat, but Frank ducked and drove his shoulder into Torrino's solar plexus. What happened next was 7 minutes of the most vicious hand-to-hand combat in mob history. Torrino was bigger, stronger, and had a knife, but Frank had something the Sicilian assassin didn't expect. 40 years of street fighting experience and the desperate fury of a man who refused to be intimidated. Torrino slashed wildly with the skinning knife. Frank dodged, grabbed a crystal paperweight from his desk, and smashed it into Torrino's temple. Blood streamed down the killer's face, but he kept coming. Frank picked up the stiletto from the floor just as Torrino lunged forward. Steel met steel in the center of Frank's office. For 30 seconds they danced around each other, knife against knife, experience against brute force. Torrino was a killer, but Frank was a survivor. Every move Torrino made, Frank had seen before. Every attack Torrino launched, Frank countered. When Torrino slashed high, Frank went low. When Torrino stabbed forward, Frank stepped aside and cut back. The first wound Frank opened was across Torrino's left forearm, not deep, just enough to make him bleed. The second was a puncture wound in his right shoulder. By the fifth cut, Torrino was starting to understand that he wasn't fighting a businessman. He was fighting a predator who'd been pretending to be civilized. "You think I got where I am by being soft?" Frank asked between attacks, his voice still eerily calm. "You think I built an empire by backing down from killers like you?" The stiletto found Torrino's ribs. "I've been cutting throats since before you were born, Rocco. I just got better at hiding it." By cut number 10, Torrino was bleeding from multiple wounds and starting to panic. He'd never met anyone who fought like Frank Costello. Cold, precise, methodical, like surgery, like art. Frank wasn't trying to kill quickly. He was sending a message with every slice. Cut 15 opened a gash across Torrino's cheek. Cut 20 punctured his thigh. By cut 25, Torrino was on his knees, begging, "Please, Costello. I was just following orders." "I know," Frank said, circling the broken assassin like a shark. "That's what makes this educational." Cut 31 took out Torrino's left eye. The skinning knife fell from his nerveless fingers as he screamed, clutching his face. Cut 32 was a precise slice across his remaining good eye. Torrino was now permanently, irreversibly blind. "Can you still see me, Rocco?" Frank asked softly. "No. Torrino so ved. I can't see nothing good because I want you to remember this conversation when you crawl back to Mar—" Frank knelt down beside the broken killer. "Tell him that Frank Costello doesn't bow to tradition. Tell him that the future just introduced itself to the past. And tell him that the next assassin he sends better bring more than 2 knives." Cuts 33 through 36 were quick, efficient, symbolic, one across each palm, so Torrino could never again grip a weapon properly. One across his throat, not deep enough to kill but deep enough to scar, and one across his forehead, a permanent mark that would let everyone know he'd failed to kill Frank Costello. Frank stood up, straightened his tie, and walked to his desk. His gray suit was splattered with blood, but his hands were steady as he lit a cigarette and picked up the phone. He dialed a number from memory. "Maya, it's Frank. We need to talk." Maranzano just made his move. Frank took a long drag from his cigarette, looking down at Rocco Torrino crawling across his marble floor, leaving a trail of blood toward the door. "And I think it's time we made ours." That phone call led to a meeting that would change everything. Within 6 months, Salvatore Maranzano would be dead, killed by Jewish hitmen sent by Maya Lansky on Frank's orders. The old Sicilian order would crumble. The National Crime Syndicate would be born, and Frank Costello would emerge as one of the most powerful crime bosses in American history. But before any of that happened, there was Rocco, the Blade Torrino, stumbling blind through the Chrysler building lobby at 3:23 p.m. on March 15, 1934, 36 knife wounds covering his body, 2 eyes gone forever. The reputation of the most feared assassin in New York destroyed in 7 minutes. Building security found him collapsed by the elevators, barely conscious, mumbling the same thing over and over. "Tell Maranzano the devil wears a gray suit. Tell him the devil wears a gray suit." Torrino never killed again, couldn't kill again, spent the rest of his life as a broken beggar on the streets of Little Italy, a living reminder of what happened when you underestimated Frank Costello. People would drop coins in his cup and ask him about the scars. He'd always give the same answer. "I met a man who was more dangerous than he looked." Frank Costello had his office cleaned that afternoon, replaced the bloodstained carpet, and kept his 3:30 appointment with a city councilman about favorable zoning laws. When Maya Lansky arrived at 4 o'clock, he found Frank calmly reviewing documents as if nothing had happened. The only sign of the afternoon's violence was a new cut crystal paperweight on Frank's desk and a small bandage on his left hand. "Everything all right, Frank?" Maya asked. Frank looked up from his papers and smiled. Not the fake smile of a politician or the cold smile of a killer, a genuine, almost peaceful smile. "Everything's perfect, Maya. I just remembered something important." "What's that?" "Sometimes the only way to teach respect is to stop asking for it and start demanding it." Frank closed his ledger and stood up. Maranzano thinks tradition trumps intelligence. Torrino thought muscle trumps mind. They both learned today that evolution doesn't ask permission from the past. The story of Frank Costello's fight with Rocco the Blade Torrino spread through the New York underworld like wildfire. Not just the violence, though that was legendary enough, but the lesson. Frank Costello, the man who never carried a gun, who solved problems with words instead of weapons, who represented the new civilized approach to organized crime, had proven he could be more savage than the savages when necessary. But here's what made Frank different from every other killer in New York. He didn't enjoy it. That night, alone in his penthouse, Frank Costello sat in his study and wrote in his private journal. Today I remembered why I chose intelligence over violence. Not because violence doesn't work, because once you start, it becomes the only language people understand. I won't make that mistake again. And he didn't. From that day forward, Frank Costello never personally killed another man. He built his empire through negotiation, corruption, and strategic alliances. He became known as the Prime Minister of the Underworld because he governed rather than ruled, negotiated rather than demanded, and eliminated enemies through politics rather than bullets. But every boss, every enforcer, every would-be tough guy in New York knew about March 15, 1934. They knew that underneath the diplomat's suit and the politician's smile was a man who could carve up the city's most feared assassin without breaking a sweat. They knew that Frank's civility wasn't weakness, it was choice, and choices can be changed. Rocco the Blade Torrino died in 1962, 28 years after his encounter with Frank Costello. He was found in an alley in Little Italy, clutching a newspaper clipping about Frank's testimony before the Carve committee. The headline read, "Costello refuses to show face on TV." In the margin, someone had written in shaky handwriting, "He showed me his face once. I wish he hadn't." The 36 cuts that ended Torrino's career as a killer became legend, but the real story wasn't the violence, it was what came after. Frank Costello proved that day that true power doesn't come from being the most dangerous man in the room. It comes from being so dangerous that you never have to prove it again. That's the real legacy of March 15, 1934. Not the blood on the marble floor or the screams echoing through the Chrysler building, but the understanding that intelligence backed by the capacity for violence is the most dangerous combination in the world. Frank Costello didn't just defeat an assassin that day. He defeated the idea that brutes will always triumph over brains. 36 cuts, 7 minutes. One lesson that would define the next 40 years of American organized crime. Never underestimate a man who chooses not to kill you.